Good morning and welcome everybody to our multi-platform service for the Unitarian Church of Staten Island. I'm David Michaels. It's wonderful to have you all with us. For those joining in person, please maintain social distancing. Masks are optional. Feel free to sing along to the hymns, read along to the responsive readings. Also, please join us through those doors in the parish hall after service for hospitality. That's coffee, cake, etc. For those joining online, we send special greetings to you. We hope you take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat box. And after service, you're all invited to a virtual coffee hour. Some announcements: weekly gatherings include our women's group via Zoom Wednesday at 7:30. Please see Kathy Santo, who is here, if she just raised her hand, if you have any questions about that. And right next to her is our husband, Tom. Please see him for the men's meetings. Please support our social media outreach. Please like and share our weekly posts on Facebook. And remember, all of our services can be seen on YouTube. And those joining in person, now's the time to silence your phones or mobile devices. And now let us prepare for this morning's service. So on this MLK Day weekend, our reading will be from Nicole Hannah Jones and Renee Watson. Our opening words, rather. Nicole Hannah Jones and Renee Watson from the 1619 Project. And the people who were born on water survived, kept living and living. It was illegal to teach enslaved people how to read, but they birthed generations of teachers and librarians, scholars and authors. They were broken-hearted, beaten and bruised, but they became healers, pastors and activists, doctors and counselors. They passed on their stories through the stitch of a quilt, shared secret messages through songs. The people survived, the people fought. And because the people survived and because the people fought, they finally got their freedom. And because the people survived and because the people fought, America has equality in the law. And because the people survived and because the people fought, America began to live up to its promise of democracy. It is the people who fight for this democracy still. Now I invite you to join me in the lighting of our chalice. You can find the affirmation in our order of service. We light this chalice in the search for truth and the spirit of love. We unite in worship and fellowship. As an extension of our chalice lighting, I want to take a moment of silence to light these candles for some of the names who have been recently affected by police brutality. We cannot cover all of the names of those affected, but this morning we light a candle for the life of Talmadge Bryant, for the life of Bashay McDaniel, and for the life of Paul N. Kader Jr. May these lights be a symbol of our commitment to continue the work of racial justice and to proclaim that Black Lives Matter. Now please join us in singing hymn number 210, Wade in the Water, in your gray hymnal. Please stand. Now's a time in our service for joys and sorrows. If you're visiting us for the first time, this is a time when you can introduce yourself. Those who are gathering in person, we invite you to raise your hand and then stand when you're seated. I will give you this microphone to share your joy or sorrow. We invite you to share what's in your heart. And those joining us online, we invite you to type in the chat your joys and sorrows. Eric and John will read them aloud. And we also invite you to share what is in your heart. Sally?
Hi, my name is Sally, and I had a really amazing day yesterday. I went to Washington, D.C. on a bus that, hi, Simone. It was a bus that a man who couldn't go to Washington, D.C. for the Palestinian rally, he donated one of 5 buses, and he provided breakfast and lunch, and the bus was full of just amazing people. I sat next to a man from Mauritania who had come to this country just 6 months ago, and hearing his story and hearing the story of some of the other people who were on the bus was part of the thrill. And the rally was huge. It was like 400,000 people. I don't know if it was on TV or not, but it was just amazing. And we stood in the cold for 3.5 hours. There were a lot of speeches, but I think they were broadcasting it around the world. So because it was happening all over the world, and it was very moving to be there. So it was quite a day. I hadn't been to Washington, D.C. for a rally in a long time, so it was quite amazing. And today at 2:00, if you're available, at Fort Wadsworth, Roxanne Mustafa has organized a kite flying for Palestine as part of something that's happening all around the world too. And 2:00, if you know how to go down to the beach at Fort Wadsworth, I'll be there. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally.
I'm Kevin Clark. Many of you know that my wife Carolyn is our regular organist and hasn't been here in 8 months or more. She had uterine cancer, had the operation, took the chemo. Everything's looking good, but it's so slow for her to recover and get her strength back. She spends 20 or 22 hours a day in bed. And it's beginning to worry me, so we've called the oncologist. We're going to see him next week and see if there's something that they can do to help her recover more quickly, and find out if this is normal or if this is an exception. So please keep us in your thoughts and prayers. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Hi, I'm Randy Leeson. Had a very nice day yesterday. It was my 73rd birthday. And I'm off this coming week to the first trip, first vacation I really had in 5 years.
Happy birthday. Gary, then Kathy.
Hi, Gary. I wanted to share, so I'm just going to dodge the light, share a joy of mine. Recently, I've been studying for an exam, phlebotomy, and I passed. Had a lot of anxiety about that, but I made it. Thank you.
Congrats.
Hi, Kathy Santo. Nice to see all the faces, new faces and old faces. Hi. I just wanted to share the joy of being in this church. We have an event coming up in February with Curtis High School, and they were asking me to research one of the founding members of the church, George William Curtis. And so I knew a little bit about him already, but I was reading more about him. And he was one of the founding members of the Republican Party here on Staten Island, which was the party that elected Lincoln at the time, because that was way back in the 1860s. And he was a great orator, and he was a publisher of Harper's Bazaar, and he knew all those transcendentalists from up in Massachusetts. And he was quite a striking figure, although we don't really talk about him much here. We always talk about the Shaws because of their connection with abolition and the Civil War, but he was an abolitionist as well. And he kind of kept the church going at a period of time where there was hardly anybody here and they didn't have enough money for a minister. So he would do the sermons. And although he was a great orator on his own, generally he didn't do his own writing. He just used sermons of other ministers. So, and he did that for 4 years at a time, as I said, when the church was kind of had a rocky time. So, because all the members of the church were so involved in political things. So, you know, it kind of makes me feel good to be here and to be here today and to talk about, you know, again, civil rights and, you know, and human rights, basically. So, thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah, Giovanni here. I went to the Whitney on Friday. As you know, some of you may know, from 5 to 10, the Whitney is free every Friday now. And on second Sunday, at least for some part of the day, it's free. The main reason I went there is because I wanted to see this soon-ending exhibit that ends on January 28th by an African-American artist by the name of Henry Taylor. Suffice it to say that with some of the words that I have heard here today, there's significant overlap between the content of that exhibit and, you know, what's being dealt with today at the service. In other words, there's tribute paid to Martin Luther King, to various people of African-American ancestry that have been murdered by the police, a tribute to the Black Panthers, and a bunch of other things. So if you want to learn more about those kinds of things, I strongly suggest that you go to that exhibit. If you're on a budget, go and it's free. It's easy to do things online now with the Whitney for free tickets than it was before. Anyway.
Thanks for that, John. And,
Okay, just tagging on to Kathy's comments about, I'm Chris, to George Curtis. just to remind folks, if you're not fully aware, that the board has been working on a project for quite a while now, connecting us with the New York Landmark Conservancy, and they are in the position to be able to submit us for historic site designation through the state and the Fed, and they've been doing the research to create that application, which is going to be pulling together a narrative that we can then be using in other ways. Randy has been like pulling together our archives, meaning file boxes that are like all over the place. So he has his little lab in the back of the parish hall, and he's pulling together all our files. New York Landmarks Conservancy has been able to come and make and have better access to our files, working with Randy, just to find our stories and find our histories. Because like Kathy said, like, we know we have this abolitionist blah, blah, blah background, but do we really know the stories of the people that are involved? Look at a lot of the street names on Staten Island, and you'll find that a lot of those folks were members of the Unitarian Church of Staten Island. So just to be aware, and we'll be hearing and seeing more about this as all the work is really pulled together.
Thank you, Chris. Again, Randy? Oh, you were just...
Randy again here. We have a number of works of Curtis in the library, actually, so when February rolls around, I'll bring them out.
All right. Are there anybody else or anything online?
Mike Stein says, Sally, I'm impressed that you went and withstood the cold. Kevin, we will keep Carolyn in our thoughts. And Randy, happy birthday. And Mike Stein also says, I also acknowledge the amazing work Randy has done to the church history.
Anybody else? We'll now pause for meditation. To focus our meditation, I will offer two quotes, very similar quotes, one from the Buddha thousands of years ago, and then one much more recently from Martin Luther King Jr. So after I read these quotes, I invite you to begin the meditation with 3 deep breaths. And after a few minutes, I'll ring the bell again to mark the end of our time. So from the Buddha, hatred can never put an end to hatred. Love alone can. This is an unalterable law. And from MLK Jr., darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Our reading today is from Why Can't We Wait by Martin Luther King Jr. Time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to work to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. And now is a time in order of service where we take an offering. We know it's the gifts of all of us that help support our ability to thrive and gather. For those attending in person, we'll be passing around the collection plate. For those online, links and instructions will be posted in the chat. You can mail us a check or donate through the PayPal giving page on our website. Please give as generously as you can, and our offerings will now be gratefully received. Oh, and the offertory music is going to be a group effort, right? The hymn number 1024 in the teal hymnal.
We're recruiting everyone into the choir this morning. Please take your teal hymnal, turn to 1024, got some instructions for you. We're going to sing it 6 times. That sounds like it's very involved. It's not. We're going to replace one word, the word do. The second time was sing, the third time dance, the fourth time laugh, the fifth time shout, and then we'll go back to do. I'll shout the word out to you. You got to do when the Spirit says do. You got to do when the Spirit says do. When the Spirit says do, you got to do, oh Lord. You got to do when the Spirit says do. Spirit says do, 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 Spirit says do. Sing. You got to sing when the Spirit says sing. You got to sing when the Spirit says sing. When the Spirit says sing, you got to sing, oh Lord. You got to sing when the Spirit says sing. Spirit says sing, 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 Spirit says sing. Dance. You gotta dance when the Spirit says dance. You gotta dance when the Spirit says dance. When the Spirit says dance, you gotta dance, oh Lord. You gotta dance when the Spirit says dance. Spirit says dance, 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 Spirit says dance. Laugh. You gotta laugh when the Spirit says laugh. You gotta laugh when the Spirit says laugh. When the Spirit says laugh, you gotta laugh, oh Lord. You gotta laugh when the Spirit says laugh. Spirit says laugh, 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 Spirit says laugh. Shout! You gotta shout when the Spirit says shout. You gotta shout when the Spirit says shout. When the Spirit says shout, you gotta shout, oh Lord. You gotta shout when the Spirit says shout. Spirit says shout, 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 Spirit says shout. You gotta do when the Spirit says do. You gotta do when the Spirit says do. Okay, now, the way the order of service is arranged, for next and sing hymn. But to make it easy on you, you could stay in your seat. If you're great. One, second, one. One, second. Since you're rested and sitting down, really sing out.
Thank you. We're happy to have Regina Cassidy joining us once again to speak to us this morning. Regina is a lifelong Staten Islander, as well as a wife, mother of 3, and grandmother of 4. She is a teacher, social worker, and an interfaith lay religious leader. So please welcome Regina Cassidy this morning.
Thank you, David, and it's great to be with you all again today. It's been a while. In my life, as David just said, I've been a teacher, a social worker, and a chaplain. In training for each of these positions in school, we were always told, begin where the person is at. Begin where the person is at. And this may be very obvious in teaching. For example, I couldn't start a first grader off with algebra. But it's not always that obvious or that easy. How about being aware of subtle things? I can't teach a first grader well in any subject if he or she is sitting in front of me hungry or coming from a shelter, if they haven't had breakfast. The same is true with social work and chaplaincy. I can't begin with my own agenda. If someone comes to me homeless, can I skip over that to get to deep psychological issues from childhood? No, first things first. I must find them a place to live. I can't begin with my own advice, my own direction, but first I must listen. I must listen and let the other person tell their story. Only then would it be helpful for me to offer guidance or to advise them. Well, today I must have to say, I have to turn this around. I must begin by telling you where I'm at. I need to tell you my story, and only then can I listen to your wisdom and your guidance. I'm not coming to you as an expert, but rather as a seeker of answers for a direction. In fact, I'm desperate to hear what you have to say today. That's how strongly and also how helpless I feel about this. So, this is where I'm at. When Dave asked me last fall to come and speak to you here in January, I readily agreed. January seemed like a long time off, and I was sure I'd come up with a good topic by then. A short time later, my date was changed to this weekend, and I was asked to speak about Martin Luther King. And one of the times I was with you in the past, for whoever might remember, I shared that Martin Luther King had a tremendous influence in my life from the time I first heard about him when I was in high school. That was about 50 years ago, when race issues, civil rights, and the Vietnam War were being addressed. Back then, I was drawn by MLK's teachings and practice of nonviolence. So I thought today's talk could unfold easily, readily, and I would know what I wanted to say. It's a weekend to honor a great man. So what could be hard about that? Well, it's been very hard for me to prepare for today. Extremely hard. I'll say it from the start. Well, why? It would have been easier if I was told, give a brief biographical sketch about his life, talk about his actions, talk about what he did. I've read enough and studied enough about him over the years to have a good foundation. But in thinking more deeply about him, I realize that my knowledge is superficial. Reading is not action, nor is it expertise. I've taken a part in marches in my life. I've taken part in prayer vigils, but nothing where I really risked getting arrested or injured. My demographic makeup, my appearance does not put me in any real danger either. So I'm not really an expert on living the philosophy of Martin Luther King. And why do I keep bringing up the word expert? Well, in the course of my conversations with Dave for today, I asked him for a summary of what people had spoken about recently, so I wouldn't be too repetitive. I must say that I'm sorry I asked you, Dave. Everyone he mentioned seemed to be experts in their field. Should I say that was intimidating? Yes, extremely. So I asked myself, well, okay, what am I an expert about? What could I speak about with you today? What did I come up with? Not much. Sure, I know a little about a lot of things, but a lot about one thing, I don't know. This had me stumped and frustrated, shut down really for quite a while. What am I good at? Finally, and I mean finally, like maybe this past week, I said to myself, I guess I'm an expert at asking why. Asking why, asking what, asking how. And I'm an expert at being a student. I've gone to many schools in my life, gotten degrees, but there always seems to be the next thing for me to learn. Something just beyond my grasp. I'll tell you what, I finish one thing, my kids will always say, okay, now, Ma, what's the next thing you're gonna do? Now I've come to accept the fact that I'm an expert in not knowing. I'm an expert in not knowing. And I've come to think that maybe this is not a bad thing. Saying that is actually a big step for me. I've always wanted to know. I've always wanted to know the answers, and I've always wanted certainty. That is, until I accepted recently what a few trusted people kept trying to drill into this thick skull of mine. The only certainty in life is uncertainty. The only certainty in life is uncertainty. And I say I've accepted this, but that doesn't mean I'm satisfied with this. It would be easier to come here and say, I know this about Martin Luther King, and go home, blah, 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 blah. And maybe you would have learned something. But no, I must stay here in front of you today as someone filled with uncertainty, as someone filled with not knowing. As soon as I knew I was to come and speak about him, the words and title of his 1963 book, Why We Can't Wait, hit me. These are compelling words to me. And so I ran around my house of many books looking for a copy of it. I found many other books of or about him, but not that one. And finally, I requested it from the library. I was delighted to get my hands on it finally, and I saw that King was writing about civil rights and racism in the 60s, saying that Black people could no longer wait to be given their just freedom and rights. The time was ripe and right. It had to be done not at some future date, but it had to be done then, in the present, in 1963. We heard his call for action and work in our second reflection read by Dave today. In it, he said, human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to work to be co-workers with God. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do what is right. And returning to our first reading for today, talking about this tireless effort and work, was taken from the words of Nicole Hannah Jones in her children's version of her large, massive work, the 1619 Project. And her children's version which I like the simpler language in it, Born on Water. It's a beautiful book written in poetry. This first reading holds a promise that despite the tremendous odds and obstacles they were facing, Black people struggled, survived, and thrived under terrible racism. That doesn't mean it was without pain, and by no means does it mean it is now accomplished. Not at all. They worked to secure rights. It was not simple and not easy. It took 400 years to secure equality and freedom, and the job is still not done. We know that. Which leads me back again to our second reading. MLK writes in his 63 book, Why We Can't Wait, that the problem is not merely the result of outright racist behavior, but rather the direct result of the inactivity of people who claim to be on the right side, the correct side. And finally, to circle back to my opening remarks for today, this is where I'm at. This is where I'm coming to you from in this year, this new year, 2024. I'm scared. His words stating that the problem is the direct result of the inactivity of people who claim to believe in just and correct behavior. Well, I am one of those believers, but I'm afraid. I'm afraid to act, and I'm afraid not to act. This is the place I'm coming to you from today. This is my place of expertise in asking why, what, how. This is my not knowing, my uncertainty. What am I to do? Now, I asked Martin Luther King today permission to apply his wisdom to our political situation and volatile temperature in our country today. I've always been one, since I've been a kid, to write letters to newspapers. Nowadays, I also call radio shows, contact local politicians, arrange meetings with them. And these actions have always turned out fine. But then a few years ago, things started to change. I campaigned for a local Democratic candidate in several neighborhoods on the island, where people told me that while they supported him, they could not put up a sign in their neighborhood because of community response. They told me they were afraid. We've always put up signs on our own lawn at home. Although recently, those signs disappeared and our fence started to be covered with stickers from the opposite candidate. Not far from here, at the last election, I volunteered to hold up signs at a polling place at a nearby site, at the proper location by that polling site, only to be reported to the election officials inside. And finally, after being an outspoken resistor to our local St. Patrick's Day parade policy toward LGBTQ open participation, led me to find the next day that our home was pelted with eggs. Though I can't prove anything, the situation had to be handled by the police. And now the 2024 election looms in front of us, and I am afraid. I hate to admit it, but I am afraid. And I am afraid to even put signs up on our lawn this time. How much deeper is my fear then for the future of my country, of our country? As an idealistic youngster, I always thought I never could have been a citizen who sat by in Germany when Hitler massacred the Jews. Yet what am I doing right now in this country? Right this minute, and I mean this minute, I have the opportunity to do something. And all I can say in front of you is that I'm afraid. Well, as I said, this is where I'm coming from, and this is why I desperately want to ask you today, what are your questions? What are your fears? Perhaps what are your hopes? I told Dave that I do have hope. I'm not without hope at all. I see the faces of my 4 little grandchildren and I see hope. But it's my responsibility to make things better for them, isn't it? As King said, the time is always right to do what's right. And it's also been said, I believe, but help me in my unbelief. So could I ask you now, would you be willing, maybe with Dave's assistance with the microphone, could you give me any thoughts either on your fears, as I've addressed, or on your ideas, very concrete ideas, very concrete call to action of what we can do? Maybe you're talking about what previous speakers have said here, but what can we do in this situation we find ourselves in this country? Not some foreign country, but this country. What can we do? So I'm asking now, if you wouldn't mind participating.
Regina, my name's Sally. I really want to thank you for your openness. I always enjoy your honesty and openness. So, and the question that you asked, to me, what we can do is we can provide space for others to speak out. If we speak out about something, to me, it always gives a little courage to somebody else to speak out on something that's hard to speak out about, like putting up and also being part of a community. You can be part of our community here. We want you to be part of our community, and we can support you. If something happens, I remember my brother had rocks thrown in, breaking the windows of his house in Port Richmond when he stood up against something that he thought was right. And people came to his house to support him, and that made a big difference. So we can be there for you. If something happens to you, you have to let us know so we can be there for you. And if anything happens to somebody else here like that, we have to be there for them and open up a space for them. To me, that's what we can do.
I really appreciate that, because really when the eggs were thrown, that really brought it to home, and I was scared. We really were scared.
So, Julia, first and then Mary.
Thank you for asking the question, what can we do? Because in many ways I feel exactly how you feel, very, apprehensive about the future, about the way things are going, how the right is going after DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, how that is they're going to attack that and tear that down. I always have to ask myself, as a white person, I can see the inequality only externally because I have white privilege. So it's always hard to find out what is the right thing to do or say in a moment. But I think one of the most important things we can do for those of us that are white and have white privilege is to intervene and point out when there is something that's obviously racist going on. I think that's a really important responsibility that we have because we benefit from our society's white supremacy, So I think that is incumbent upon us to, and I'm sure a lot of you had these experiences when I was younger and working, and like in my 20s, like white coworkers who were in positions of power would say things to me that were shockingly racist, and I would be shocked by it because they felt we're both white, so we have a contract about this racism. And I wasn't in on that contract, but I was too frightened to address it or, say anything about it. I'm thinking of two instances that are just really shocking to me. And I think white people, we really have to stand up and point that out. And to being afraid, right after the last election, maybe about 4 or 5 days after Biden won, I have a Biden sticker on my car. I was in Brooklyn, and 2 young guys pulled up next to me in the car, and they started yelling at me and screaming at me because I had a Biden sticker. And, I just try to laugh it off. I did like a L loser sign. But then when the light turned green, then they started following me. And I got really scared, and they followed me for about 8 blocks, screaming things at me. And I was like, I just have to focus, I'm not engage them. And then finally, when we were approaching a busier place, they turned off. And I was so relieved, because I was like, these people are nuts. I don't know what they're gonna do. So I identify with your fear, but we have to stay strong. We have to support each other, like Sally said. And for the white people here, we really have to speak out and stand up, which, we're Unitarian, so we have some familiarity with doing that. So we should just do more.
Thank you for that.
I wanted to echo Sally in terms of thanking you for your honesty. I have to say I experienced something similar probably in that same election period. I have a house that has a big fence on a corner, and I had many different signs, a lot of things my son put up in that election. And one morning I came out and there was a toilet in front of my house that was filled with, I'm not going to say what, but it was shocking. But I really think it's very important that we, as a community, provide support for people who are dealing not only with that, but looking for places outside of our community as well as within our community where there are attacks. We're dealing in an epoch of extreme polarization, where there is an enormous amount of fear to stand up for what is right because of that backlash. So I think it's very important that we look at ways that we can do things, and provide material support in different ways so that people recognize that they're not alone and they don't just have to cower and stop what they're doing to stand up for what is right.
Thank you.
Yes, Regina, thank you again for just making yourself so vulnerable and really speaking out what all of us feel, but would have a hard time often getting up in public and saying. So I can't thank you enough for that. My mind goes to 2 things that are not so much about being, well, they are taking a risk, but more like an emotional risk. One being that this idea in our culture that entertainment has to so often be connected to creating a bad other or a hero to be had, that superheroes are folks who take care of bad people. And the fact that that has descended into the youngest entertainment that we have, and that we don't have new narratives of what superheroes do, which is a proactive spreading of love and non-prejudice and inclusion and celebrating diversity. And yes, there are issues, but we don't always have to have these bad people. We have people who unfortunately from confusion, ignorance, upbringing, or whatever, do bad things. And I don't know exactly what we all do about that, except be conscious of it and hopefully think about it in terms of our grandchildren and our children and what we watch and what we spend money on for entertainment. But I think it's important. This creation of the bad other has sort of taken over our society, and it includes people of different political opinions. So my second thing is, and I've been listening to people recently talk about this, how do we get less attached to our strong political opinions? We fight for justice and we do all those things, and yet a bit more evolved in having relationships with people who do have different political opinions, so that maybe somewhere in there some common ground can be found, rather than just sort of dismissing these folks and saying they're not. Mother Teresa said once, as soon as we begin judging a person, there's no room for love. So how do we work on that?
Thank you. If I could just ask for one question about when you mentioned about the heroes and the bad guys and so on. Just if you could explain that 1 second more, because I thought that was interesting. It went through my head how my little grandchildren, as young as 2, love Spidey. You know, now it's Spidey rather than Spider-Man. But all those little heroes and the Paw Patrol, there's always a bad guy, and the Paw Patrols go after them. And is that what you meant? That
I do. What the research has been showing is over the years, the entertainment industry, including Disney, there's always a moral in there, and there's always a little list of things that you can learn about coming back from hardship, or finding out what to do if your mother's died or something like that. But increasingly, there are these other characters in there who are doing bad things that don't need to be a part of the narrative of learning courage or bravery or things like that. And the research actually shows that when the storyline contains both of them, it becomes even more addictive when they put those sort of either microaggression or macroaggression things in them. And I just would mention there's a website out of Australia called raisingkids.com or .org that literally will take a film or a TV series or a little cartoon kind of thing and show all of the things that are violent. And it is unbelievable, the list, and something that many people would be taking very young kids to see. Now, it'll also mention, well, there's something about courage and bravery and telling the truth and whatever. But it's all mixed in with this stuff that is not helpful, not just to young people, but to ourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting me talk about that.
Hi, my name is Rebecca. Thank you, Regina. I really appreciate it. Your questions about what can we do and your fear and your admission of fear has really echoed thoughts and feelings that I myself have had since the quote unquote world collapsed in 2020. I was in college at the time. And so my entire world changed very drastically, as it did for many of us. But for me, it completely changed my life path in terms of what I wanted to do. I picked up a religious studies major, and I pursued a research project that looked at new religious movements in the United States and North America generally. And my entire project was focused on understanding the correlations between white supremacy, evangelical Christianity, the political right, et cetera, as well as other new religious movements in the United States that tend to lean towards the right. It was not exclusively evangelical Christianity, though that was one of my overarching themes. And I'll bring that back in a second, but tangentially, I work with children. I work in childcare. And one of the tactics that I have learned is the most effective way to understand children, to work with children, is also one of the most effective ways that I pursued my research, and that's listening. So we've had multiple people talk about the courage of speaking up, but I think that there's also a lot of courage to be had in listening and understanding other people. I think especially as a person who holds a certain level of privilege and therefore holds a certain level of safety in these conversations, I can ask questions and I can listen. And if you can understand the hurt at the core of where someone's opinions lie, it can get you really far in a conversation of understanding their viewpoints, understanding where disinformation is coming from. And it can give you a really solid basis on which to speak up. I think there's a lot of talking over each other that happens, and there's not enough people willing to meet another person where they're at. And I think, personally, that's one of the most powerful things that can happen in terms of changing the world and changing the course of history, is meeting each other where we're at and finding the core of the hurt that brings us to the opinions that we hold.
Thank you. Excuse me, thank you.
Yes, thank you first for articulating what a lot of us are feeling. I too am a child of the 60s, and as you can see, my marching days are over. But I would like to say that I think, again, I find a lot of hope in my grandchildren. It's fascinating to see the younger generation, how they, a good many of them, approach the world now. But I also, I think that on an individual basis, we can join organizations, we could do, that's wonderful. But I've had a couple of encounters, and of all places, Starbucks lately, because you wind up sitting at communal tables and someone will sit down and maybe they'll just ask me, what are you reading? And I'll say, and I tend to read interesting books. And so that'll start a conversation. And by being non-confrontational, and like you said, listening, you would be surprised at how you're not really going to change somebody's mind, but you do give them food for thought. And I think in a way, those little nuggets sometimes do help, because you're helping, one individual at a time maybe, and making them, think about something that they weren't thinking about before. And so, to me, it's a bit of a contribution. It's certainly not as big as I would like to. The impact isn't as big as you can when you're, organized together. But I do think that as individuals, we can do something, and I think the difference, though, is in the 60s, again, I was young and I wouldn't say foolish, but you didn't have that fear. And it was extremely tumultuous times, but there is a fear now that that type of violence, that individual violence, people acting out like that, it just wasn't part of the narrative. It was different, and I do understand it. But I think maybe as an individual, whatever we can do, we should do. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you again, Virginia. As everyone said, I always enjoy listening to you speak. And this is a subject that's very near to my heart right now, because it taps upon, even though you say stay in the country, it's taps upon what's going on overseas. I don't believe that, I think we all individually have a part to play, and not necessarily the same part. For instance, myself, I tend to speak up against injustice everywhere, not only politically, but in my everyday life, in my work. I've always gotten negative backlash. I've always suffered the consequences, but it has never deterred me from continuing to do it. I'm an advocate for seniors who are being abused. I've been retaliated against. My life has been threatened, but it never stopped me from doing it. I'm saying that to say, that's who I am. That's not necessarily how you are. Maybe how you make an impact in some other way. And what hurts me right now, and has been hurting me for some time, is not being able to do anything about what's going on overseas. And when I see injustice, it really hurts me if I can't do anything about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Simone. So it's interesting how, the universe works. I have a practice, and I tend to attract a BIPOC population, and then it's, I would say, pretty inclusive. I do have some white clients as well. And I had a session with a client that's Jewish the other day, and we were in the office. Really, it starts off light, talking about the holidays, catching up. And then it gets to speaking about loss. And then it gets to speaking about what it's like to be a Jew in this country and in New York City, of all things, right? And very tearful, and lots of tears and fear, even for her, around wearing the Star of David, right? So then we start to talk, and it did really make me think about fears that I had around George Floyd, and and also it happens around COVID, right? And whether I wanted to do marches, and then there was the storming of the Capitol, and we live in Staten Island, and you don't know, I'm now a single mom, and what are some safety risks that I have to manage, right? So I think that part of the conversation came to like, how do we manage safety? But then also a desire to be able to have a voice. And I think these answers are not very clean. It's not very exact. Where I had a semblance of safety at one point, you realize I think it's a bit of an illusion, right? And you have to kind of think about how you weigh this thing that's sort of maybe a fantasy with realities. It might be a privileged position to say that you're safe, and you're safe enough to be able to do this and do that and do the other. And then if it shifts a bit, you have to reevaluate, like, can I, like you said earlier, you'd like to think you read certain things and you could project yourself to that time and say, oh yeah, I would have been like the Joan of Arc, right? And then if you face it and you're like, okay, if I am, I may be the last parent that goes down, right? Or I may not be able to work, right? So these answers, I think, are not so exact, and I think they're always shifting and changing based on your circumstances. The idea of asking questions, to be honest, takes a lot of courage as well. When I work with the people I work with, they're high level, whatever it is, that went to Cornell, that went to Dartmouth, that went to whatever, and now they find themselves in these spaces where they're the only person of color, and they have to ask questions. Can they? That can take courage, depending on how these questions are received within these spaces. So I think, to go with what Claudette had said, I think that activism can look very different depending on the factors, depending on safety, what safety looks like from one context to the next, and what you have to weigh in terms of what you could lose. Am I willing to lose that? For me, I have to say, I'm not willing to die. I can't. I have 2 children, but I'm willing to do certain things that I think will help me be safe and help them be safe in the long run, right? But I'm not going to physically, unless I'm taken, I can't risk my life.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Thank you all so much. Oh, do I have a participant here?
Some people have things to say in the chat. So Mike Stein says we need to be able to feel safe to speak our minds and motivate others to feel willing to do that. We need to support each other in this exploration, both about what is going on here and in the Middle East. And Maureen says, I also thank Regina for her honesty. I too am frightened about these times. The extreme polarization where I see even Democrats demonized as demons. These are scary times. And Maureen also says, remembering church member Rich F., who made an effort to talk to people who thought differently. Thanks for the reminder of doing this, Carol. And that's it.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. You know, I'm really overwhelmed, and I'm given a lot of hope from hearing, well, that I'm not alone, but also that, like you said, different ways for different people, but there is things that we can do. And I definitely appreciate that. And I'm really am very glad that I'm here. And like you said, I have your support. And that's the way I'd like to conclude today, not knowing what you were going to say, but I was looking up the word church, and it says the word church is a translation of the Greek word ecclesia, which is defined as an assembly or the called out ones. The root meaning of church is not that of building, but of people. It's ironic that when you ask people what church they go to, they'll usually say which building, when church is actually a body of believers, like we have here today. Doing these things that we just talked about, that you just mentioned, as a group, as a church of like-minded people, that may actually have unexpected benefits. Most of the places I go as a preacher, people will say to me, why can't we get more people to come out? How come we only have 10, 20, 30, and so on? We used to have hundreds. Actually, the answer may rest, I was thinking, with those of us that are present, because our church has to be a valid community, and I think that's where you come across very strongly and very well. Being a valid community, does it really do what it believes in? Does it really mean what it believes in? Are we valid? And in the words of Martin Luther King on this, he said, there was a time when church was very powerful. It was a time when people rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed in. In those days, church was not a thermometer that recorded the ideals and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. And he continued that if today's church does not capture the sacrificial spirit of early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club. He said, every day I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. But he concludes by saying, I am thankful that some noble souls from the ranks of organized religion have broken loose from the reins and paralyzing chains of conformity and joined us as active partners in his struggle towards freedom. Their witness has been spiritual salt in these troubled times. They have carved a tunnel of hope through the dark mountain of disappointment. Now, remember I said that people keep asking me why our church is emptying. Would church as described by MLK attract more people if its mission was to stand up and actually do what's right without the fear that I expressed to you today? I think that's what you're all saying. And I can only guess, but I think that would make and result in a change in participation. One thing I do know, as he said, is that we can't wait. So I thank him for his words, and I thank all of you for participating today.
Please turn now in your great hymnal to number 149. Many of you have probably heard this described as the Black national anthem. But it's not about one color, unless it's red. We all see the same. Stand up and sing with enthusiasm. This is a wonderful hymn that speaks a wonderful message. Pass it to the younger generation. Please come continue the conversation in the next room with coffee and cake and fruit and maybe some vegan food.
Thank you, Kevin. And now we'll extinguish the chalice. You can find the words of affirmation in our order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. For these we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And our closing words are from Marshall Gans. Democracy is not something you have, but something you do. It is a verb, and we are creating it or uncreating it all the time.